look, you can see in March of 2023, passenger traffic was 20% lower than what we had in 2019. And by the time we got to March of 2024, it's less than 1% below where we saw 2019. So this is, again, important that we're seeing the recovery of the market. And there's quite a few things that drive this recovery, and I'd like to share a few of them with you. The first thing that we see is that in the past, we've seen GDP and passenger traffic be very closely aligned and follow on the same path. Beginning in 2020 and 2021, we saw that the RPKs and GDP separated quite a bit, but as we come back into 2024, we're seeing that air traffic is starting to realign with the economic fundamentals, and we think that this is important going forward because of the strong ties between passenger traffic and GDP. Another thing that's helping really increase passenger traffic growth are the low unemployment rates that we're seeing. So as more of the population is employed, it means that they have more disposable income to be able to travel. And so if we look at around the world, we can see that these light blue lines are what the average unemployment rates were between 2010 and 2019. And we can see that unemployment during that 10-year period was as high as 9 to 10% for the EU, for Middle East, North Africa. And the blue bars that we're looking at is what the unemployment rates are in 2024. And what we tend to see is that there's a gap between the high point and where we are today. And so this is important to continue to watch as we go forward because it does help drive increases in passenger traffic. Additionally, another item that our team tends to watch is what does the travel spend look like? And if we look at the US, what we're seeing is that real personal consumption for air transportation, again, dipped down in the 2020-2021 timeframe as people were not able to travel. And we saw other things such as spend on furniture and household equipment really strengthen against where we were in 2019. But as we saw that markets started to open up again, people who had been saving started to spend more of that disposable income on travel. And you can see that as we've gone over the last 2 to 3 years, we're seeing that spend on air transportation is now at 20 to 30% higher than where it was in 2019. Again, this is important as well for our airlines around the world, because as people are able to travel, they're able to purchase more tickets, which are making more profitable airlines and able to have them grow as well. And then finally, when we think about what drives the ability for people to travel, a growing middle income really helps support air travel. As more people enter the middle class, their propensity to travel really starts to increase dramatically. What we are seeing, our middle class households are projected to grow by roughly 500 million through 2042. And 90% of this is in emerging markets. This concentration in these emerging markets really are a key reason why we are seeing that strength in the passenger growth over the last 2 to 3 years. And we expect that this is going to continue going forward. We'll take a look about this a little bit more when we start looking at what our forecast looks like over the next 20 years. I also wanted to bring up air cargo because when we think about air cargo, it tends to be a little bit different than the passenger market. Some of the things that really help drive an increase in air cargo excuse me, is that we see trade growth recovering. We see demand in semiconductors rising. We are starting to see inventories normalizing. So during the pandemic, there were some supply chain challenges that impacted our inventories. But now that we're starting to see that normalize, we're really seeing it helping grow our air cargo. The other thing that we're really seeing growth in is e-commerce. What we're seeing are some of the new e-commerce companies like Temu and Shein really being able to help support this growth in the global air cargo. Another interesting thing that we've been watching when we think about the air cargo market are some of the maritime shipping disruptions. So there are some geopolitical issues occurring in the Middle East that are making travel through some of the straits in the Suez Canal a little bit more challenging. Additionally, there have been droughts going on in Panama, which have reduced the number of ships that can go through the Panama Canal. So this is all helping drive near-term air cargo growth. If we take a look at where the growth has been, what we've been seeing is that, in 2021, we had a strong increase of about 20% in cargo ton kilometers. So that's how we measure air cargo. And then we saw that drop down as we had some of that supply chain challenges going on. And then finally, what we've been seeing is we're anticipating air cargo to grow about 5% in 2024 and additionally in 2025. And so these are really some of the economic fundamentals that we see really driving both the passenger market and the air cargo market. Additionally, when we think about the state of the industry, we think about some of the trends that we're seeing with the airlines. And what we're seeing with the airlines is that they're really focusing on simplification of their fleets. And so we've seen over 75 airlines around the world reduce the number of types of airplanes that they have, the number of families, by at least one. That way they have a more streamlined fleet and a more streamlined strategy going forward. Another thing that we've been seeing airlines do over time is that the leisure travel, if we think about the different types of air passenger travel, we have business travel and we have leisure travel. And we've seen that leisure travel has been a little slower to come back than we have with leisure travel. And when we think about the leisure traveler, they are focused on traveling for long weekends. So we see the leisure traveler traveling maybe on a Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, whereas the business traveler would have traveled more on a weekday. When we look at where airlines have been placing their schedule, what we've been seeing is that they're focusing on increasing their schedule on the days of the week that the leisure traveler would travel, as opposed to focusing more on those business traveler days of the week. Another item that we've been watching as a trend from the airlines is that they're really focusing on providing customers with the types of services that they want. And so what we've been seeing is that airlines have been starting to add more premium economy cabins to their aircraft. And what we're seeing is the leisure traveler who may not necessarily want to pay for a business class ticket, but has additional funds and they want to travel in a different style than they were in the past. And we're starting to see that the premium cabin, the premium economy cabin on airlines are doing quite well and generating additional revenue for the airlines. Additionally, we think about the airline trends, but we also think about the fleet trends that we see. And what we're seeing is that there's been a dramatic growth in the single aisle airplanes. And really what that's been driven by is that uptick in that domestic travel that we've seen. And so the efficiencies of that single aisle airplane really make it more efficient for the airlines to operate in those shorter haul markets. And so we've seen that increase. We've also seen a decrease in the regional jet market. Many of the regional jets are flown in North America. And what we've seen is that the efficiencies, the costs being driven by those regional jets aren't as efficient as a single aisle airplane. And so we see many airlines moving, upgauging, what we would call it, moving from a smaller size to a larger size airplane and moving into the single aisle fleet. It doesn't mean that there's not a need for regional jets. There still are. There's still a lot of smaller markets that may not be able to support larger airplanes where we see that, but we tend to see that airlines are focusing on where they can get cost efficiencies. And so really that all helps us explain why we're starting to see growth in the passenger and cargo market compared to where we've been in the last couple of years. Now, when we take a look at what we focus on from IATA, if we think about the revenue that's being generated, what we have seen is that back in 2019, airlines were generating about $800 million or $1 billion in revenue, and then dropped off in 2020, 2021. And we're now starting to see revenues come back to where they were in 2023, and we're anticipating additional growth in 2024. What this means is that the net profit for 2023 is expected to be somewhere around $20 billion. IATA's just recently come out with an update for 2024, and they're anticipating net profit to be close to $30 billion for 2024. So we continue to see strength in the passenger traffic, which is driving profits for the airline industry. So with that, I'd like to change gears just a little bit, and let's focus a little bit on Indonesia. And let's take a look at some of the trends that we're seeing in the Indonesian market. What we tend to see is that Indonesia is really a key leader for the Southeast Asia region. If we think about the population of South
Research methodology in aviation research. Kemudian masuk ke sesi ketiga, nanti ada individual group discussion untuk qualitative methodology in research. Sesi
So if we look at Indonesia as part of the Southeast Asia region, Indonesia is 40% of the Southeast Asia population. Over 279 million people are in Indonesia. If we look at the aviation market, so I'm looking at capacity here, average seat kilometers. So if revenue passenger kilometers was the number of passengers on an airplane times the distance that they flew, ASK's average seat kilometers are the number of seats on an airplane times the distance. You'll also hear this called capacity. And so when we look at that, what we tend to see is Indonesia is the largest aviation market in Southeast Asia. If we look back to 2023, there were 142 billion ASKs flown to, from, and within Indonesia. And you can see that only Thailand and Malaysia come close to where we see the aviation market in Indonesia. It's the 7th fastest growing aviation industry in the world. And if we look at the number of passengers, over 390 million passengers are going to be flying to, from, and within Indonesia by 2037. So it's a very important market. and a very strong growing market. So why is this important? The economic impact of international is very, very substantial to the Indonesian economy. If we look back at 2021, tourism employed over 10 million jobs within Indonesia, and travel and tourism account for 2.4% of the Indonesian GDP, which, if we look at where we were in 2020 or 2019, GDP travel and tourism was about 5.6%. And so we see that there's room for growth to come back up to 2019 levels in Indonesia, but it's also a very important contributor to the economy. And so that's why we're all here today to focus on the aviation market around the world and how it connects to Indonesia. If we look at the top 9 countries in Asia Pacific that added the most capacity, again, we can see that Indonesia is the second largest contributor to capacity. What we tend to see is that the top 10 countries are responsible for adding 60% of the incremental seat capacity since 2010. And so when we think about the world, we can see that most of the growth is coming from Asia Pacific. The fastest growing were 3 countries in Southeast Asia: Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam. And so we can just see that this is very important. If we think about this, just to kind of put it into scale, the US grew barely 2% annually, less than half the global average, but still added the second most seats by any country globally. So while this is fast growth, there are still somewhat bigger countries, but growing at a little bit slower rate. If we look at the capacity driven by the Indonesian airlines between 2010 and 2019, what we can see is that the airline capacity growth exceeded the global growth by over 50%. So this light blue line here is how the entire industry grew. If we look at this darker line above it, this is the growth that the airline in Indonesia grew. And so what we're seeing is that there's quite a bit of capacity being driven by the airlines that are based out of Indonesia. And we're expecting that to continue to grow as we go forward. And then if we take a look at the Indonesia passenger growth, so this is looking at traffic to, from, and within Indonesia. We're seeing that the passenger traffic is not quite back up to where we were in 2019, but we are seeing strong recovery. So the total industry is about 76% of where we were in 2019, driven by the domestic market, which is about 72% of the market, and then the international traffic is about 85%. And so again, when we're looking at the state of the industry, what we're looking at is the difference between domestic and international. And we can see that the trends for the Indonesia market are very similar to what we're seeing for the world market. And that we're also seeing is that Asia Pacific is still recovering. And a lot of this is being driven from the China markets, because the China market for international traffic has been very closed down until 2023. And so many of the countries bordering China and within the region have close travel connections with China. And as those markets recover, we're expecting that that's going to continue to recover into the Indonesian market as well. So now if we move into the long-term fundamentals, this is our commercial market outlook, or you may hear it called the CMO. One of the reasons that we do the commercial market outlook is because we use it to help shape the Boeing product strategy. So our team will sit and focus on what the forecast is for the next 20 years. And what will you do is we'll take that information and share it with our product strategy teams. And this will help them determine where we think that we need to be moving our products over the long term. It helps guide our long-range business plan. So when we're thinking about what sort of production rates that we need to have, what we need to be producing and how we need to be producing it, we'll use our CMO to help guide those long-term production plans. We'll also use this to help prepare our supplier partners. So it's really interesting. Our first forecast was done back in 1964. And if I were actually with all of you today in person, I have a copy of that first forecast that we did. And what we were doing it for was a supplier conference. We were using it to share it with our supplier customers so they would better understand where we thought the market was going, and it would help them be able to prepare their businesses and grow their businesses in order to help support where we saw the market going. The final thing that we use our forecast for is to really help inform our airline customers. So if we think about the airlines, generally airlines are focused on the next 2 to 3 years, maybe 4 years. They're not necessarily looking out long term because their business is in the here and now. And so what we will do is we'll share our forecast with our airline customers to give them an idea of how big we think the market is going to be and the direction that we think that the market is going to be growing. And this allows them to look at that information and create their strategies. So where should they be flying? Where do they think that they will be able to grow in their market space? And so really it's important across the whole ecosystem to help prepare and share where the market is going. Really, the Boeing CMO is one of the longest running complete worldwide jet forecasts. And one of the questions that I get asked a lot about this is how accurate is the Boeing forecast? And we've gone back and looked at historical forecasts, and then we compare it to the deliveries that have been made in any given year. And what we tend to see is that our forecasts tend to be a bit conservative. We tend to probably be about 10% conservative on our numbers, but still, again, provides a good outlook for the industry to focus on. So when we think about what goes into our forecast, we look at multiple items that really help us think about the direction and the growth of our forecast. One of the first things that we start to think about as a team, and when I'm talking about our team, there are 6 people in the product forecasting team that focus strictly on the passenger forecast. We're divided up regionally, as it was mentioned earlier. I do the forecast for Southeast Asia and China. But we also have another team that focuses on the cargo market, and that's another 4 people who do that forecast. And then we all work together to be able to pull all of these forecasts together. So when my team is looking at what do we think is important as part of a forecast, the first thing that we look at are the airline strategies. And so essentially what we are becoming is many CEOs for an airline thinking about, if I were an airline, what is my strategy? What sort of business model do I have? Do I have a network carrier? And when I talk about network carriers, we're thinking about airlines that fly both domestically and long haul. So we would think of airlines like Delta or United or Singapore Airlines as a network carrier. We'll also start to think about, am I a low-cost carrier? And how does that strategy differ from the network carrier? And what we tend to see is that many low-cost carriers have simplified fleets. They're only flying one or two types of airplanes because it lowers their costs for maintenance. It keeps crewing costs more efficient, and it makes them have a little bit lower cost structure. And so we'll think about that as part of an airline strategy. We'll also think about, am I going to fly long haul? So am I doing routes, say, from Indonesia to London, or am I focused regionally? So I'm focused on where I can fly to within 3 or 4 or 5 hours. And that plays into the strategy that an airline may take and what sort of aircraft decisions that they might make on that. And so we go through approximately 185 airlines and think about what those airline strategies are going to be and how they're going to grow. Once we figure the strategies out, we start looking at economic growth, because as we talked about a little bit earlier, economic growth is really essential to growing passenger traffic and cargo traffic. And so we have our business environment team who follows the world economies. They focus on GDP, they look at inflation, they look at a whole range of items that will impact economic growth. And what we'll do is we'll see where the economic growth is and calculate where we think traffic is going to grow based on those economic indices that we're seeing. We'll also look at fuel price. And what we tend to see is that when we're focused on the airline industry, depending on what the fuel price is, really impacts what a airline's cost structure is going to be. Generally, fuel prices are anywhere from 30 to 40% of a airline's cost structure. Another 30 to 40% are for labor costs. And depending on where those fuel prices go will really impact the type of airplanes that an airline will take. Generally, when fuel prices are lower, we see airlines may be more willing to keep older airplanes. But as fuel prices go up, what we tend to see is airlines want the most fuel efficient airplanes that they can get, because it helps reduce the fuel price that they are paying because of those efficiencies that they get out of those new airplanes. So we look at the fuel prices as an indice of where do we think that the airline purchasing strategy is going to go to. Another item that we look at is market liberalization. And so when we think about market liberalization, there's really a few things that play into this. We will think about how easy is it for a passenger to travel between one country and another. Are visa policies liberal, easy for people to be able to get visas? Do they need a visa to go into a specific country? And what we see is that market liberalization from the passenger side will help grow between two countries or even two regions. The other thing that we look at when we think about market liberalization are the rights that the airlines can obtain to fly between two countries. So when airlines fly between two countries, it's the government that negotiate the ability for those airlines to travel. And those are called freedoms of the air. And there's 6 or 7 different freedoms that tell airlines how they can operate between 2 countries. So if you have 2 countries that don't have liberalized routes for airlines, country A may say, you can fly 10 times between my country and your country. And so if all of those routes are being used, airlines aren't able to grow. So we'll look at where that market liberalization is going and how that's going to enable growth going forward. We also look at airplane capabilities because that's what we're really focused on. What sort of airplanes do we think that airlines are going to purchase, and how is that going to work in our forecast? So if I'm a airline that's flying from London to, say, Singapore, I want to make sure I have a long-range airplane that can fly that route without a stop. We think about airlines like Qantas who have started flying from Perth to London. They're using 787s because it has the range to fly those distances. We also look at the short-haul flying. Doesn't make sense to have a wide-body airplane fly a route of 500 miles. Maybe, maybe not, but it all depends on, going back to market liberalization, airline strategies, and those capabilities. So we're always focusing on that. We also make sure that we understand what that competitive landscape looks like. And so when we're talking about competitive landscape, it can be anything from other airlines competing with me, but we also have to think about things like high-speed rail. So when I'm thinking about the China forecast and I'm looking at the domestic China market, I want to make sure I understand what the high-speed rail lines look like in China. Is there going to be growth in those routes that are available from high-speed rail? And how are those going to impact the aviation growth within China? So we're looking at that. After 9/11, and we saw a lot of the security impacts be put on to certain routes, we started to see people looking at driving shorter distances. So if it was going to take a person 2 hours to get through the airport because of security, and it was a drive of 3 hours, you could see a car as a competitive landscape item in this area. So we make sure that we understand what that competitive landscape is for each of the regions that we're focusing on, and what may be competitive in one region may not necessarily be competition in another. We focus on the emerging markets, and as we saw, a lot of that growth in Asia has been coming from the emerging markets. And so what we tend to see as more people come into the middle class, that's really driving what this market looks like. So we want to make sure that we understand what the emerging markets are and where they're growing. And as you can hear, a lot of these different considerations are tied together. Economic growth versus emerging markets, airline capabilities, and the competitive landscape. So these are all moving pieces that we look at when we're thinking about the forecast. We want to make sure that we understand what the sustainability environment looks like. We want to make sure that we understand any regulatory items that may be coming up and how that could impact growth in a particular market going forward. So my colleagues who have Europe, where we see a lot of regulatory items coming out of, want to make sure they understand what those items are, and again, how they're going to impact the growth. And then finally, the last thing that we think about is airport infrastructure. And so are the airports big enough to handle the number of passengers that are going in there? Are airports congested? So at airports, generally, there are a certain number of airplanes that can take off and land during a given hour. Is there enough infrastructure in place to allow growth of airlines at a particular airport? And so we make sure that we understand what the airport infrastructure and congestion is. Additionally, you want to make sure you understand what the infrastructure looks like to get to the airport. You could have an airport that has all of the capacity available in the world, but if people can't get there, maybe there's not roads or public transportation to get there, then that becomes a challenge for the passenger to get to the airport, and it's going to impact passenger and travel growth. And so really, there are a lot of different pieces that go into what the forecast drivers and considerations are. And these are just some of the top ones that we look at. There are other items that may go into the forecast that aren't labeled here, but they all really support where do we think markets are going to grow and where do we think markets are going to contract. And so once we start looking at all of this, what this really does, it helps us with our long-term forecast, really driven by those fundamentals. And if we take a look at the current market outlook that we released last year in 2023, what we tend to see is that the world economy is expected to nearly double from $92 trillion to $155 trillion by 2042. We're going to see passenger traffic triple, and so it's going to go from 6 trillion revenue passenger kilometers up to 20 trillion revenue passenger kilometers. So again, tripling of that market. And then what we see is that the cargo market is also expected to nearly double over the next 20 years, growing from 260 billion RTKs to 630 billion RTKs. And what this really means is that the fleet going forward is going to more than double. So we're going to grow from a fleet of 24,500 airplanes to a fleet of 48,600 airplanes over the next 20 years. So a lot of strong growth for the market. From there, we start to look at what are the new airplanes needed to support that growth. And what we see is that over the next 20 years, the world airlines will need over 42,595 new airplanes to support the growth. We look at these by sizes of airplane. And so what we tend to see is for the forecast, over 76% of those new airplanes are going to be delivered as a single aisle airplane. What we would see in this category are airplanes, single aisle airplanes, 90 seats up to about 200. You would see airplanes like the Embraer E190, E195 being in this category. The 737 MAX family is in this category, and the A320neo would be in this size category, as well as the COMAC C919. And so what we tend to see is that the single aisle airplane is the backbone of the airline industry and the backbone of our forecast. In the wide body category, we see a need of 7,440 new airplanes. In the wide body airplane category, the types of airplane that you would see here are the 787, the 777X family, the A330neo, and the A350 would be in this category. Regional jets, while we don't participate in building regional jets, we like to make sure that we understand what that size category looks like. And it tends to be fairly small, and it's mainly a North American market. But we see a need of about 1,800 regional jets, and those are jet airplanes under 90 seats. And then finally, we see a need of about 925 new production build freighters. So these are the freighters that are coming out of the manufacturer's production facility. These aren't passenger airplanes that have been converted to freighters, but they're actually what we would call new build production freighters, and a need of about 925 of those. We also look at the regional breakout of where the airplanes that we're forecasting are needed. And we tend to see that there's a pretty even distribution, with about 20 to 23% needed for the airlines in Eurasia, North America, Asia Pacific, and China. And then the remaining 10 to 15% will be going to the airlines in the Middle East, Latin America, and Africa. So it's a very well balanced forecast going forward. We like to look at how the fleet is being delivered. And so if we look at the new deliveries being delivered to support that 48,575 forecast, what we tend to see is that it's evenly split between replacement and growth. So 21,000 airplanes are going to be used to replace airplanes that are currently flying today. So these are replacing older, less efficient airplanes. And then the other half is going to be used for growth. And this is where we see airlines growing into new markets. This is where we could see new airlines entering the fleet. And so it's a very evenly split forecast. I want to spend just a few minutes thinking about cargo. And some of the cargo drivers are a little bit different than what we just looked at in terms of the drivers of the overall forecast. So when we think about the air cargo market, in addition to some of those other items that we're looking at, we look at what trade and industrial production are doing. So trade is very closely linked to the growth of the air cargo market. So we make sure that we understand what trade is doing and what industrial production is doing as a way to see how that market is growing. The other items that we look at are the evolving supply chain strategies. So when we're thinking about companies around the world, what sort of supply chain strategies do they employ? Are they focused on just in time? So the companies themselves don't hold inventory, but have it brought in as they need it? Are they using supply chain to bring parts in for them to build additional items? And so we make sure that we understand some of the evolving supply chain strategies and how that may impact the air cargo market. We also look at the e-commerce network growth, because what we're tending to see is e-commerce has a lot of, provides a lot of growth for the cargo market. So as companies are trying to get their goods out to the consumer, we think about how they're going to support that sort of growth. When we think about the air cargo market, what we tend to see is that it's generally for a very small volume of high value goods. It's for perishable items. So when we think about things like flowers from South America going to North America, flowers from Europe going to other parts of the world, you could see things like seafood being flown as airline cargo. And so it's high value goods, perishable goods, or sometimes goods that just have to be there very quickly. So you have a machine that has a part that's out, and you need to get that part to your company as fast as possible. So we'll see people use air cargo to move those parts around quickly. And so when we think about the cargo fleet, what we see is that there will be a need of 2,825 deliveries. So when we think about this area of the forecast, we're looking at two different pieces of it. We see that this is new build airplanes. So these are airplanes that were built as dedicated freighters. And then we also will see in this number what we call converted freighters. These were airplanes that originally started their lives out as passenger airplanes, but as they left the passenger segment, they've been converted into a cargo aircraft. And so really over the next 20 years, the freighter fleet is forecasted to see a 2.5% annual fleet growth, just slightly lower than some of the global economic and trade activity. Roughly 2/3 of these airplanes are going to be delivered from conversions. And when we think about the converted freighter market, 70% of these are standard body. So standard body is the same as what we would call single aisle airplanes. So these are 737 NGs, the next generation 737-800s that are being converted from passenger airplanes to cargo airplanes. At this time, there isn't a new build production single aisle freighter. So airlines who want to operate standard body freighters have to have a converted airplane. We see a total need of 885 new build and converted medium wide body freighters and 650 converted and large freighters. So the total fleet is going to grow from 2,270 airplanes up to 3,745 airplanes. When we look at growth versus demand or growth versus replacement, when we're thinking about the freighter fleet, what we tend to see is that about 48% of these deliveries are going to be used for replacement, and then the other 50% are going to be used for growth of the cargo fleet. So just a little bit different than what we saw with the passenger fleet, with leaning a little bit more towards growth than replacement. But these freighter deliveries are going to really increase the efficiency of the fleet. And I thought since we have aviation personnel, I reached out to one of my colleagues in our Boeing Global Services. They do a pilot and technician outlook. And I thought that it might be interesting for you to see what this looks like. And really what we're seeing is that over the next 20 years, there is a need for over 2.3 million new commercial aviation personnel. If we look at the breakdown of this number, we see a need of 649,000 new pilots, 690,000 technicians, and over 938,000 cabin crew. Really what we tend to see in the pilots, demand is really exceeding supply. And so what we've been seeing are airlines and flight schools are really increasing capacity to meet these needs. We also see standards for competency and evidence-based learning coming into play as well. There's a lot of pent-up demand for maintenance. With some of the delivery challenges that the industry is seeing, what we are seeing are airlines are tending to keep their airplanes a little bit longer. So there is demand for more maintenance on these airplanes. We're also seeing that competition for labor and really kind of an aging workforce is driving demand for more technicians as well. Additionally, when we think about the cabin crew, we see really high attrition and turnover, but this is being driven by fleet growth and upgauging leading demand. Training is really being supplemented with augmented and virtual reality. So again, a strong forecast going forward for our pilots and technicians. So when I was talking about our numbers a little bit earlier, I was showing you what the world forecast was and mentioned that about 20 to 25% of that forecast is made up by Asia Pacific. And so I just thought I'd share with you a few of the things that we're seeing in the Asia Pacific market, and then we'll take this down to what the Southeast Asia forecast looks like. So if we think about the year 2042, what we're going to be seeing is 51% of the world population will live in Asia Pacific. It's going to be generating over 44% of the world GDP. 42% of all single aisle deliveries will be going to the airlines in Asia Pacific. 45% of the wide body deliveries. And if we think about the total fleet share, 41% of the total fleet are going to be with the airlines in Asia Pacific. This is up 10% from 2019. So we tend to see that Asia Pacific is going to be very strong and leading the growth for the world as we go forward in our forecast. So overall, Asia Pacific is going to need 17,545 new airplanes by 2042. And what we tend to see is the distribution is very similar to what we saw for the world forecast. So 13,510 airplanes are going to be delivered as single aisle airplanes. 3,380 airplanes are going to be delivered as wide body airplanes. And then you can see a small number of regional jets, about 400, and freighters will be about 255. When we look at the breakout, when we think about Asia Pacific, we have 5 regions that comprise Asia Pacific. About 50% of all the deliveries are going to be going to the airlines in China. 24% are going to be going to the airlines in Southeast Asia. And then we'll see about 15% to go to South Asia, 8% going to Northeast Asia, and 4% to Oceania. What we tend to see are South Asia, Southeast Asia, and China are all large growth markets, while the airlines in Northeast Asia and Oceania tend to be older, more mature markets, and this is more of a replacement market than a growth market in these 2 regions. So if we think about Asia Pacific and looking at the different components of it, Southeast Asia is one of the fastest growing economic regions. Over the next 20 years, GDP is expected to grow at 4.2% annually. So a lot of strong growth here. And then if we look at what we call our traffic flows, what we tend to see is traffic flying within Southeast Asia is expected to grow to 1,152 billion RPKs by 2042. And we can see that this is one of the faster growing regions around the world. China, North America, within North America are the 2 largest. But again, if we look at where the growth is, Southeast Asia, intra-Southeast Asia is one of the fastest growing markets that's in our forecast. We were talking earlier about the increasing middle class households growing. And what this really shows us is that there's a high propensity to travel in Southeast Asia. And when we're looking at propensity to travel, what we're doing is we're looking at the annual passengers per capita versus the GDP per capita. And each of these dots are a year that show how fast that passenger traffic has grown or will grow. And you can see the fast increase for Indonesia, as well as Thailand, Philippines. And so what we tend to see is that there is a lot of growth in the propensity to travel over the last 2 decades. And that's really expected to continue to grow over the next 20 years. If we take a step back and we're looking at the Southeast Asia traffic, what we tend to see is over the next 20 years, GDP is going to grow at 4.2%. And if we think about passenger traffic, so RPKs, the passenger traffic to, from, and within Southeast Asia is expected to grow 8.1% annually over the next 20 years. So this is, again, one of our fastest growing regions. And you can see, again, there's the intra-Southeast Asia flow down at the bottom, growing at 9.3%. But then you can see traffic to South Asia growing at 10.5% per year. Traffic to China will be growing at 19% annually. And even some of our smaller markets, such as Europe, growing at 5.3%. We can see that there is a lot of strong growth going into the region. And I want you to think about the flows that we're seeing a lot of traffic, and think about if you were an airline flying and trying to gain some of this passenger traffic, what do you think would be the most efficient, appropriate airplane for you to fly within intra-Southeast Asia? Or what do you think some of the aircraft types would be needed to fly to China? And are these the same type of airplanes that would be used to fly to Europe or the Middle East? So start thinking about what you think those airplanes would be. And when we look at the next slide and look at where we see the airplanes and what type are needed, if the airplane types that Boeing is forecasting match what you have in your mind as the type of airplanes that are needed here. Do you think you need a wide body airplane, or do you think you need a single aisle airplane when it comes to, intra-Southeast Asia? Do you need a wide body or single aisle airplane for Europe? And so if you start thinking about that and thinking about if you're an airline, what would your strategy be? What are the airplane capabilities? And then you think about what type of airplane that is, you're ready to be a Boeing forecaster. So overall, Southeast Asia will need 4,225 new airplanes over the next 20 years. And if you guessed that you needed a single aisle airplane for the intra-Southeast Asia flow or the Southeast Asia to China flows, you'd be correct. We see a need of 3,390 new single aisle airplanes needed for the Southeast Asia forecast, 770 wide body airplanes, which would be used to fly some of those longer haul flows, such as to Europe or even the Middle East. We see a need of about 45 new regional jets and 20 freighters. And if we look over here to the right, you can see the percentage breakout that this equals about 80% single aisle airplanes and about 18% of wide body airplanes. So again, the breakout is very similar to what we saw for the world and for the Asia Pacific forecast. Where this really differs from the world forecast, if you remember what we were talking about, growth versus replacement, for the world, it was about a 50-50 split between growth versus replacement. But when we look at Southeast Asia, this is a very high growth market. And so for those new deliveries, about 83% of those new deliveries are used for growth and only 17% for replacement. So again, thinking about where we're seeing a lot of the growth, where the airline strategies are, it's really a very big growth market. So a lot of need for new airplanes in the Southeast Asia region. And finally, I wanted to just share, while we've had a tough few years in our forecast, what we have seen is aviation has really proven to be resilient time and time again. The industry has had numerous recessions. We've had external shocks, pandemic, geopolitical issues. And what we've seen is that while passenger traffic goes down, we've seen it come back again. So if we look at this little hit here, this was 9/11. And what we saw was that it took about 3 years for the aviation industry to recover from the shocks of 9/11. In 2008, 2009, we had the Great Recession, and it took a couple of years to recover from that. And what we can see was, passenger traffic had started to grow above trend, and then the COVID impact happened, and it's taken about 4 or 5 years, but what we're starting to see is that passenger traffic is coming back to trend. So again, it's a very resilient industry and will continue to be resilient. If you would like to have more detail on our forecast, I recommend going out to the Boeing external website. And if you type in www.boeing.com/CMO, you'll find more information on the commercial market outlook, as well as detailed information on our world air cargo forecast. And then there's more detailed information on that services market outlook. So if you want more information on how Boeing Global Services views the services market outlook, there is a lot of information out there. And so with that, I'd like to thank all of you and would love to take any questions that you may have.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Ms. Shauna, for the insightful and informative presentation. Before we move on to the Q&A session, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the presence of distinguished Director of Indonesian Pilot Academy, Director of Aviation Polytechnic of Makassar, or their representative, Mrs. Veronica Andrew as the President of Boeing Indonesian Association, and Mrs. Christine Kristiawati as the Safety and Regulatory Affairs Principal Boeing Indonesia. We greatly appreciate your presence today. Okay, we will now move on to the Q&A session. For audience, please type your question in the Q&A section or use the raise hand feature if you would like to ask a question. All right, we have one here. Okay. So our first question is going to be from Ihsan Irsyad. Okay, the time is yours.
Excuse me, student Ihsan Irsyad from Aircraft Maintenance Engineering Batch 4, Aviation Polytechnic of Makassar. Let me ask to you, how Boeing's efforts to overcome the era changed from the COVID-19 pandemic to the new era? Maybe just that. Thank you.
So you're asking how our forecast has changed during the COVID era?
Yes, Miss.
So what we had to do was we had to think about how the economy was growing and how passenger traffic was growing. And what we saw was a reduction in the number of new airplanes that we have been forecasting. So the forecast that I showed you just a few minutes ago was slightly lower than what we saw in 2019, what our forecast was prior to the pandemic. And we had to think about how markets were going to reopen, if markets would reopen. We also went back and looked at some of the historical events that we've seen in the past. So what happened to the aviation market during 9/11, and how did we see that come back up? And we would look at the Great Recessions and see how that would change. We also looked at the growth in the years leading up to the pandemic, and what we were seeing was that passenger traffic had been growing above trend. And think about that. And, sometimes it was a little bit tough to think about seeing that growth when some markets virtually ceased to operate. But what we saw was that traffic went down for 3 or 4 years, and then we watched the economic fundamentals and the growing middle class, and was able to start to calculate that forecast again. Again, it's still a little bit lower, but we're seeing it starting to catch up with where we were in the past. We're actually starting work on our CMO 2024, and that will be released in July. So you'll have to go out to our website and look and see what those numbers are and do a comparison to what I just shared with you. Thank you for your question.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Sauna, for your response. We have another person who want to ask. Please, for James Enak, the time is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for moderator, and thank you for Miss Shauna. My name is James. I'm from ENAC University in Toulouse. I have a lot of questions for you. I'm sorry if we have a time. Can you hear me?
What is your question?
Okay, thank you, ma'am. For the first question is about your big data for forecasting. It's like my question for my assignment last semester is if I want to ask you for the best advice from you if I want to use a big data for the forecasting, do we continue to use data from the year affected by COVID-19, or do we eliminate the point affected by COVID-19 even? Your data, you give you show your data. You show your data with the new era from after the COVID-19, and you show the data with the before COVID-19 data. So, what your best advice if we eliminate the data from the COVID-19 affected or no? And for the second question is talking about the industry, airline industry. We cannot forget the flight route network system for this airline industry. So I need your best advice. In your opinion, with the best for Indonesian in determining in a flight route network system, it's a hub and spoke or just point to point? Where is the best for Indonesian aviation industry can grow with harmoniously? And the last question, how do global geopolitical tension as like and Ukraine and Israel Palestina impact to the long-term forecast for commercial passenger and air cargo demand? Particularly in Indonesian market industry. Is it good?
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for your questions. Let's start with the first one. So when you're forecasting, I had been part of the forecasting team for 10 years, went to a different organization in 2019, and then I came back in January of 2024. So I missed a lot of the excitement of forecasting during COVID. But what we tend to do is that we'll look at 20 years behind us to look at that data. So it was smoothing out some of that COVID data. That being said, when we did the 2021 and 2022 forecast, so for example, for CMO 2024, our base year is 2023. So we'll go back to August of 2023 and use that as our base year to forecast going out. And so what we did in 2021 and 2022, we used 2019 as a base year, but we also used the current base year to see how that would impact the forecast. So we used 2 different base years to be able to see what that growth looked like. And for the 2021 and 2022 CMO, we used 2019 as our base year because the data that we were seeing for 2021 and 2022 was incomplete, because there were some countries, some airlines that just weren't operating. When we did CMO 2023, so the forecast that we just looked at, we moved to we moved our base year to the base year that we would have used. So instead of 2019, we decided to focus on 2022 and explain that some of the differences that we were seeing were being driven by COVID. So I would suggest, if you're looking at forecasting, I wouldn't necessarily exclude the data, because that really tells the story of what has happened, but it helps you understand what happened and be able to explain the different choices that you made in the forecast. And so we're still using that data, but we also need to understand why it's telling us what it is. So it's good to look at both of them in order to understand what you're seeing. So it's a hard question to say exclude all the data, because we still look at it to make sure we know what it did, and that will help us going forward and seeing and explaining what happened. So I wouldn't exclude the data, but I would just be able to explain it. Now, your next question on what is better, hub and spoke or point to point? And I would say it depends. And you'll hear Boeing marketing say that quite a bit. It depends. It depends on what your airline strategy is. So a lot of times what you'll see are network carriers use the hub and spoke model, because they'll bring people in from smaller destinations and maybe connect with their longer haul routes, because maybe that long haul route can't be supported by the traffic that's in that particular city. That being said, when we came to market with the 787, what we saw was that the 787 changed the industry from being a hub to hub and spoke. We started to see the 787 connecting to markets that may not have necessarily been connected before, because the airplanes were either too big or not as efficient. And so, again, I know it sounds like I'm copying out by saying it depends. It depends what your airline strategy is. We also see low-cost carriers have changed that as well. So we see a lot of low-cost carriers fly point to point, because that's what their strategy is. So I would say, before you decide, are you going to fly hub and spoke or point to point, I would say you need to figure out what your strategy is. And depending on your strategy will depend on how you are going to operate those routes that you're flying. So you may see that it changes on your business model, it changes on your strategy, and as an airline, you may actually fly some point to point and some hub and spoke. So it really depends. And for the last one, you were asking about the forecast for Indonesia. And we actually don't do country level forecasts. We just do the regional forecast. And so Indonesia would be part of that Southeast Asia forecast. So for the region, we see very strong growth for the region with that over 8% growth. So it's a very strong market, and we continue to see the entire region grow quickly. Hopefully that answers your questions.
Oh, so Mom, so the global geopolitical tension is not give a huge effect for Indonesian industry for aviation.
Are you asking about the global political
Global,
tension?
yes, ma'am. My question is considering for the forecasting market in Indonesia, how do geopolitical tension give effect for Indonesian aviation industry?
So if you're doing a long-term forecast, what we tend to see is that there will be ups and downs of geopolitical tensions. So we tend to say that it might impact it for a couple of years, but it will go away. And so what we tend to see is that the geopolitical tensions are more of a near-term forecasting item and not necessarily a long-term outlook for the forecast.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you for your response, and thank you for some questions. We still have several people here, but I will choose one of you. Please, for Muhammad Jadi Asar, the time is short, but please make sure you need to make it short due to the time constraint. Sorry, we cannot hear you. Could you just unmute your microphone?
Thank you for the opportunity that has been given to me. First of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Muhammad Jadi Asar from Indonesia Civil Pilot Academy Study Program Diplomatry Aircraft Operation Batch 2. Okay, my question is there Boeing series that Boeing prepares for high demand of aircraft in 2042, as you said before, or still maintain of the Boeing series right now, like in narrow body, there is Boeing 737, and wide body, there are 777 and 787. Thank you.
So if I understand, your question is, will there be airplanes from today still flying in 2042?
Yes, Miss.
Yes. Yes. So when we look at the that our growth versus replacement, what we see is that in our forecast in the base year, we had 24,500 airplanes in service in 2022. And when we get to 2042, 6,000 of those airplanes will still be operating. So we will retire out 21,000 airplanes, but we'll still have 6,000 airplanes that are flying today, still flying in 20 years. What we tend to see are our airlines will keep their passenger jets for around about 25 years. And so some of the planes that are flying today will still be flying at the end of our forecast.
Thank you, Miss.
Thank you. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Sorry. All right. Thank you. All right. That will be our last questions. And thank you for your question, and thank you for the response, Ms. Sauna. We would like to thank you for your engaging and thought-provoking answer. So, to summarize today's lesson, we have explored the current market trends in both commercial passenger and air cargo sectors, examined factors driving these markets. Sorry. Okay, and discuss projection for the future development. This information is crucial for stakeholders across the aviation industry as they navigate the post-pandemic recovery and plan for long-term growth. We would now like to invite Ms. Sauna to give her closing statement. The time is yours.
Thank you. I would like to thank everyone again for joining this morning. I really appreciate all of the insightful questions that have been asked. I just want to reiterate again that, while the aviation market has had some challenging years in the last few years, aviation is a very resilient industry. And while we've seen some downturns, what we have tended to see is that the market comes back even stronger. When we look at IATA, they're anticipating that we're going to have growth of about 5% passenger traffic in 2024, and that we will anticipate over $30 billion in revenue. So what we've seen is that the market has just about recovered. Over the next 20 years, we see a need of over 42,000 new airplanes, which will be split evenly between growth versus replacement, and that we see that Asia Pacific and Southeast Asia are going to be quite fast-growing markets and contribute about 25 to 30% of the new deliveries. So again, I would like to thank you all for joining us this morning. And if you would like more information, please go out to our website, and we have different presentations as well as some Excel files on our website that provide you with a little bit more insight into our forecast. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate your time, and it has been wonderful to be able to share this with you. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ms. Sauna. And before the last session, we would also like to invite Ms. Veronica as the President of Boeing Indonesian Association to close our lecture session today. The time is yours.
Thank you, Ms. Era. Thank you, Sauna, and dear student or mahasiswa. First of all, I would like to thank you to everyone who attended this lecture, and your active participation and engagement truly enrich this class, right? Your insightful question and contribution were greatly appreciated, and please, everyone that still have question and has not been answered by Ms. Bassett, please send it to me, and we will try to give you an answer in the maybe upcoming days. And I would like also like to extend my gratitude to Ms. Era, our moderator and MC today, for leading this event so smoothly. Thank you, Ms. Era. And a big thank you, of course, to my colleague, Mr. Sauna Bassett, for delivering the extraordinary lecture. We hope the knowledge and discussion she shared with us be valuable in your academic journey and future endeavor. So remember, as Bapak Nelson Mandela once said, education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. So keep up the great work, and I look forward to seeing you next week, our next lecture, and continue grow and success. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Veronica, for the closing session. Before we end this session, I would like to inform everyone about our next Smart Lecture, which will be held on June 12, 2024 at 6 p.m. US time, or June 13, 2024 at 9 a.m. Western Indonesian time. And the topic will be Boeing's airplane product family, and we will be joined by Mr. Rob Dangerfield, BSc. Okay. Lastly, please make sure to fill out the attendance list before you leave. The link to the attendance form has been posted in the chat. Thank you to all our participants for joining us today and for your active engagement. Also, thank you for Ms. Sauna and Ms. Veronica, and for the director of Indonesian Pilot Academy and Polytechnic Aviation Makassar. We hope you found this session as enlightening as we did. Have a wonderful evening to Miss Sauna and have a wonderful day for everyone. We look forward to seeing you at our next Smart Lecture. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Have a good
you.
day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
everyone.
Thank you, Miss Veronica and Miss Sauna.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank
Great
you.
time
Bye-bye.
spending with you.
Thank you.
Bye. Good night.
Thank you.
Halo, Miss Era.
Halo.
Veronica.